So welcome to Fall Garden Care. My name is Caitlin Youngquist, and my husband and I own a small compost and topsoil business out of Worland called Dirtworks. And previous to that, I spent 9 years with the University of Wyoming Extension. I do see some familiar names here, folks that I've known over the years or worked with over the years across the Bighorn Basin. Looked at a lot of gardens and talked to a lot of folks, and I've really enjoyed that. So again, for this evening, we're just going to start. Just a minute here, excuse me. We're going to start talking a little bit about some of the biological processes that are at play in the garden and talking about soil. I wanted to share that I share this from the perspective of a soil scientist. I am not an expert gardener. I like to experiment a lot in the garden. I've grown a lot of different things over the years. I founded the Worland Community Garden here about 9 years ago, and we grow a lot of food for the local food pantry. But again, mostly I just like to experiment and try different things. There are some folks here on this webinar, I think, have a lot of experience as well. And I hope during our Q&A session, maybe there'll be some discussion. But what I really found that to be the most helpful is for us to have a deep understanding of the biological principles that are at play. And if we can really understand what's going on in the soil and in the environment around the plants, that gives us the opportunity to make some decisions and make some management choices to support the life, the functioning in the soil and the plants. And so, energy, of course, comes from the sunlight. That's the photosynthesis process. We want to maximize photosynthesis as much as possible for plant growth. Of course, air is a big piece of that, right? And then food, the plant food is coming from decomposing organic matter in the soil primarily, or synthetic fertilizer, or some combination of both, right? So we'll talk more about that. And then, of course, water. We want enough water, but not too much water, right? And we want enough nutrients, but not too much nutrients. And so trying to get all of these pieces balanced and understanding how all these pieces tie together in a working, healthy soil system is what I'd like to touch on a little bit today, and then some very basic ways to think about protecting our soil and feeding our soil going into the fall. And one piece here that is missing from this little diagram, or I think an important piece to understand, is the soil cover or mulch. You might hear it called soil armor, various ways to talk about that, but how important it is to keep the soil covered, especially going into the winter, right? Acts as a protective layer for extreme temperature fluctuations. It keeps the worms fed, it helps moderate the temperature, and it decomposes slowly over time and feeds the soil. And I'll show you some pictures of this in action here. So thinking about all of these pieces, we need to maximize energy, of course, during the growing season, but that's not happening as much during the winter. We want to have enough water, but not too much water in the system, and we want to have plenty of nutrients, but not an excess in the system, and keep everything covered. So a reminder that those are the pieces to think back to this as we go through this talk today. So I'd like to remind you, we often think that springtime is when we build soil, we think about compost in the spring, but really fall is for building soil. So if you take one thing away from this today, please remember that fall is the time we can make a big investment in our soil for a long-term payoff, right? And so we can do that with several things, one of which is compost, either compost we make ourselves or compost we purchase, lots of mulch, and water, right? Water is really critical. In Wyoming, it's very, very dry, and the winters especially are very dry and cold. And so adding water as much as we can during the fall and winter can make a big difference in continuing to build the biological activity and support life in the soil. So hold on to those, adding compost when we can in the fall, mulch, and water. Also, what we're looking at in the fall is fall is for decomposition. So think about the decomposition processes that happen, right? Microorganisms are eating organic materials, releasing plant nutrients from those organic materials, and they're also creating complex organic molecules that stimulate plant growth. And so we want to support as much decomposition of the organic materials as possible, right? And the decomposition process, right, requires food, air, water, and time. Okay, and those organic materials, there's anything that was at one point part of a living system, right? So that could be manure, it could be plants, it could be dead leaves, grass clippings, wood chips, and I'll show you some examples of different products you can use. But what we're trying to do is feed that system, right? Those microbes are going to eat the organic materials that you're putting on the soil in the fall. They're going to release the plant nutrients and then create these organic molecules that are going to stimulate plant growth over time. And then the other thing that's happening is the carbon that was in that manure or leaves or what have you is turning into these molecules called humus, and that is what gives the soil that earthy smell and that dark color. And also it becomes very important for water storage. And in the desert, the more water we can store in the soil, the better, right, long term. So these are all the reasons we want to really get a lot of decomposition in the garden and get that organic material kind of from its raw form into its stable, highly decomposed, very stable form. This is a diagram that I often use when I'm talking about compost, but I want you to remember this as we go through the rest of this talk tonight, because it's actually a really helpful concept to think about decomposition, right? Because you're trying to get as much biological activity in that garden in the fall as possible, and going as it'll go slowly through the winter, but it won't stop, right? And then really kick up in the spring. This is where that happens. So if these brown parts of this picture, right, these would be our pieces of leaves or manure or grass clippings or whatever wood waste that needs to be decomposed. And then right around each individual tiny particle is a thin film of water and then free airspace. And the decomposition, the microbes that are eating those and decomposing them and releasing plant nutrients live right in that little balance where there's both air and water. And so that's when I was talking earlier about too much water, not enough water, right? We want it to have some water around these particles as much as possible to really facilitate that decomposition. So as we go through some of these photos, I'll show you, remember this little diagram here. And obviously in the winter, it's hard. You can't run water all the time in the winter. There's certainly some limitations, at least in the Wyoming, in the Bighorn Basin here where it's so dry, but still think about these conditions and when you can maximize them. So I want you to also think that fall is for layers, right? So add layers of food and nutrients and cover it with mulch. That's at its most basic. And then if you're going to start a new garden area, the fall is the best time to start a new garden area, thinking ahead for the spring. If you're going to do it on top of sod, start with cardboard and then start your layers. Keep your soil cozy all winter and feed the worms. So keeping your soil protected instead of bare and cold and exposed to the elements, right? Layer and lots of layers of nutrients and covering with mulch. This is a picture of the Worland Community Garden. Some of you are familiar with this. This is our garden under a nice warm sweater of mulch for the winter, right? This is mostly alfalfa and straw. There are a lot of different things you can use. Hay, if you are going to use hay, I encourage you to use a little higher quality hay that doesn't have a lot of weeds in it, because it just makes your life easier. Straw is a good one. Leaves, of course, you may find those for free, often do, or your neighbors have some extra, or you have plenty. Compost, of course, is a great product. Aged manure, grass clippings, if you have access to wood chips or sawdust. Arborist mulch is great. If you ever see tree trimmers in your neighborhood, get your hands on that mulch or those arborist wood chips as best you can. That is a great product for the garden. And then, of course, cardboard or newspaper. Wool is another product, and I'll show you some pictures of that. Coffee grounds. There are various other things you can include in here for sure, but these are probably the ones I see the most. Alfalfa hay is even better if you can get your hands on some moldy old alfalfa hay. It's higher nutrient density, lower risk of weed seeds, especially if it's been sitting out for a couple years and it's moldy and no one's going to feed it to their animals. Highly recommend that as well. So some of the different products, that combination of leaves and grass clippings when you're picking them up with your lawnmower either in the fall or early spring is a great combination, great product. Of course, arborist wood chips and compost, or any combination of these mixed together. This is an example of what it might look like if you were going to put in a new bed in the fall, or maybe make some modifications to the garden, or you had a little bit of a weed issue, is laying down cardboard, getting that really wet, and then on top of that you can put some compost or grass clippings, a little bit of fertilizer maybe you wanted to put down, some manure, and then mulch the top of that with straw. That would be a really great way to add your layers and then add that thick layer of mulch over top. And this is what it looks like sitting all winter, and that soil is so protected and the worms are coming up underneath there and working, and it's not a very hospitable climate for weed seeds, or hospitable environment for weed seeds. And that's actually a big part of it, because leaving our soil bare, it's hard on the soil, it's hard on the soil life, but also it's just waiting for weed seeds. The other thing you can do in the fall is if you're going to put in some new raised beds, this is the best time to do it, because then come spring, they'll be more ready to, closer ready to go and ready to plant, right? And so one way we can do this, we do sell a raised bed mix, which you can use to fill your raised beds in the spring. And you can also fill it yourself with kind of layering these organic materials in the raised bed and adding a lot of water and letting it decompose over time. So what you're basically doing is composting it in place slowly, right? And then every year it'll settle and you'll have to add more organic materials on top. And so this is best to do in the fall, and it takes a lot of water and some time. And so the most important thing here is when you layer in, say, some hay and straw and coffee grounds and compost and some manure, and you can even bury some food scraps in there, really pack it with nutrients, then get it wet, and then keep it wet as long as you can run water in your hose this fall. Even if you have some nice weather in the winter, things, we get a spread of nice weather in January and you feel like you can get the hoses out, run some water on it. As much water as you can in the desert here. It is really important, and it just takes time. So what you're doing again is you're making your own compost in place. And so this can be a very economical way to fill raised beds, but it doesn't work very well in the spring because you just need time. Now, one option if you do this in the spring is you can fill the top foot or so with finished potting raised bed mix or compost or something, but it just takes a lot of time. So water and time is what those microbes need. This is another system. Again, this is best, you can do this in the spring, but really, again, I would suggest doing this in the fall. This is what I'd call kind of an instant garden. This is actually at the Wyoming Boys School near us here, where they have their juvenile detention facility there. And we wanted to help them put in a garden. And so again, right on top of sod, you can lay out the cardboard and then the compost. Now, if you think about this, there is some major limitations with this system. And one of those is that it's very, very shallow. And so the plants, as they're growing, don't have very little rooting depth, because they're not going to grow down through that cardboard and into the sod right away. They're staying right in that top 8 inches of compost. So they are and then the compost, when it goes down, is very, very dry. And so it takes a lot of water and very careful management initially to make sure you don't dry those plants out and stress them, because they have such a small soil reservoir, right? So it'd be like growing in a very, very shallow pot, so to speak, for the first year. But starting in the fall will really help to get that moisture in there. And basically what's going to happen is that the grass is going to die, cardboard is going to break down, and eventually you'll be building soil from the top down, and you'll have deeper and deeper soil, and plants will have more of a soil reservoir. So again, this is a great system to start in the fall, but it can be done in the spring, but it'll give you more time and more buffer time if you do it in the fall. This is an example in the Sheridan Community Garden. They did a similar thing. They had just a lot of weeds and they were struggling with some sections, and so they wanted to try this to, again, kind of do a sheet mulching method. So again, a lot of water. They had a little bit better soil underneath, and so they were able to dig down into that after they put the compost on top. But this is just another way of looking at that. And this is off somebody else's blog, but this is a great example of how deep you can make it and how you can really go with an instant garden with a big investment in materials right up front. But you can go right into having, and there, look, if you look at this picture here, their soil is probably, or their compost and soil mix they put in there is probably a couple feet deep. And so that gives a much bigger reservoir for storage of water and nutrients, and it's a little more forgiving that first time around. So you're not trying to grow in just 6 inches. So that's just another way of looking at that. Again, if you can start this in the fall, and if you know where you want to expand your garden, or you are putting in a new garden or filling some raised beds, this is a great time to invest in that. So I'd like to just remind you that building soil takes a lot of time, right? So lots of organic matter, and our soils are very low in organic matter here in Wyoming. So we need a lot of organic materials, and then water and time. And so, and when the soil is shallow, like those pictures I showed you, choose shallow rooted plants. and water more frequently, and then just have faith in the process and keep going, keep adding organic matter, keep adding water, and adjust your management or your planting, what you're planting where, and how you're managing your garden as that soil builds up. We just live in a place that we have very, very dry, very low organic matter soils, and it just takes a lot of effort and a lot of faith to build that up. But once you do, you then have a soil reservoir that holds water really well, provides a lot of slow release nutrients over time, and takes very little maintenance. And so it's this long sort of upfront process of building that soil, water, time, and organic nutrients, organic matter. And then adjusting your management practice. So I have some flower beds and various things around the house. And again, I'm not, I don't have the most abundant landscape around my house, but as I've slowly over the years taken a little bit of lawn out, added some more cardboard, added some more grass clippings throughout the summer, pile them on there, more leaves, leave the plants there behind, pile more on top, a lot of water, and I'm finally starting to see those roots going down deeper and deeper. So again, patience and faith in the process. Or you can go the other route of spending the money up front to buy a finished soil or compost mix and kind of jumpstart the process. So you have two options there. So there's other things you can also add as you're building and layering your soil, right? You can do some liquid fertilizers, you can do some chicken manure. If your neighbors have rabbits, that's great. Alpacas, sheep, goats, horses, cows. There's a lot of options for manure. You can also layer in some bone meal or blood meal or other dry fertilizer as you're layering in. So you might do cardboard and then maybe some leaves and compost and then maybe some fertilizer and then maybe some more leaves and compost and maybe a mulch. So you can really layer these things in as you're building the soil so those nutrients are starting to cycle. Wool is another really great product and can often be found for free or very low cost, especially the dirty wool around the bellies and under the tails of sheep in our area. It's very high in nitrogen, actually, about the equivalent of chicken manure, but extremely slow to break down, and it really won't burn anything. Increases some water holding capacity, and it does have a little bit of weed control, but not as well as a thick layer of straw or wood chips in my experience. You can add your compost, layer it if you have access to some whole fleeces, layer them out there as you're putting your garden to bed for the winter. Layer them out there and then cover them with something else. What I've noticed is the white wool, it blows around or birds pick at it, looks a little trashy in a landscape sometimes. But if you just keep it covered with hay or straw or put it sort of lower down in the layers, that helps a lot too. Or get some darker colored wool. Coffee grounds are great. If you have gas stations produce a tremendous amount of coffee grounds, as do, of course, coffee shops. They're about 2% nitrogen, which is pretty close to cattle manure, actually. And then mulch, you can use them as mulch, or you can layer them in on landscape, or just put them out as you have them from your own kitchen. You can mix them in. You can also add to compost. You really can't get enough. They are acidic, but we can't really get enough in the soil here to actually acidify the soil very well. Take a lot of coffee grounds here where we are, where our soils are very alkaline. But it's a great free resource and usually very clean, right? And very safe, no risk of any contamination. It's a great free material. So make sure you're at least keeping yours from your own kitchen. Wood ash is another one. You can overdo it certainly with wood ash, but it's a very good source of potassium and phosphorus. But of course you don't want to put it directly on seeds and plants, but it's great to put down in the fall, particularly, and let it kind of work into the landscape over the winter, or it can be mixed in with your compost. Again, free fertilizer that you might already have. And then just a little reminder, soil amendments we've been talking about, they're really for mixing into the soil or layering and composting across the soil. They're a long-term source of nutrients, and they are really for helping build the soil. So any of these types of products, if you had access to any of these types of products, could be used also as for building up your soil in the fall or in the spring. And that's very different than a fertilizer, for example. A fertilizer is designed to have a very much shorter release time of nutrients. And remember, as you're adding all of these materials, it's not only nutrients, it's also compost, right? I mean, it's also carbon, and that carbon is supporting the soil microbes, and that carbon is what's building organic matter, long-term storage organic matter that holds that water and releases nutrients slowly over years and years and years. A long-term investment. So there's two ways to think about this, right? Whether you're getting started with a new garden this fall for next spring, or you're, putting some effort and time into your existing garden. Do you have more time than money, or more money than time? And those are kind of the choices we get to make in terms of how we spend our resources. If you don't have as much money, but you have some time and maybe some free resources you can round up, cardboard, free manure, old hay, straw, wool, grass, leaves, wood chips, whatever you get your hands on, and time and water, right? That's your process there. If you have some resources to spend on this, cardboard, if you need that, maybe you don't need cardboard, maybe you're just adding it to your existing garden if you're not putting in some new garden beds. Quality compost or raised bed mix if you're putting in a raised bed garden, straw or hay mulch, and then there you go, you're good to go, right? So those are two ways to think about that. Making your own kind of compostable materials on site, layering it, letting time and water do its magic, or bringing in some finished compost. And what we're looking at here, what our long-term goal is to really build some beautiful, biologically rich soil. And when you pick up a handful of soil, it smells good, it looks full of life, it feels like it's full of life. That's what you're going for, right? Like this picture on the right side here. This is after several years of no-till practices in the community garden, adding a lot of mulch, letting the worms really go to work. The one on the left is out of a conventionally farmed sugar beet field here. Again, very dependent on heavy inputs each year to grow something. Once you build up that life in your soil, then the soil starts to support itself, right? Support the plants. So that's what we're looking for long term, and you'll know that smell and that feeling. And here's an example too. The other thing is don't necessarily be in a hurry to clean up your garden this fall, pull everything out, till it up, and create a blank slate that sits empty all winter, right? Don't be in a hurry to do that. Leave those roots in the ground. This is an example of where corn was planted. Just cut the tops off and left that there. Those worms are decomposing those roots. It provides them food and habitat, and also for the microbes we can't see, but for sure for the worms that are a tremendous asset to your garden. And if there's no reason you can't plant something else right between those rows next spring, or take those out in the spring if you want, but leaving that kind of cover in the fall that's already there. You already have mulch that you've grown in your garden all year. Might as well leave it there, right? Now this might be different if it was diseased, or you had some weeds that you were concerned about getting out of there. But again, let nature take its course, right? We don't need to clean everything up and have it a blank slate, all clean, tilled, ready to go, right? This is another example, the same thing, this mulch here, and then on the right, you can see where I just picked up that mulch a little bit off the ground, and those worms are coming right up to the surface and working right underneath that mulch, right? They would not be there if that soil was bare. They would not be working up to the surface, right? And they're eating all of this, and then they're pooping it out, and then they're making channels for air and water in the soil, and the nutrients that goes through their digestive system, and then it becomes very plant available. So they're a tremendous ally. This is another example, again, after this soil being covered all winter, but on the side here, it kind of blew away or slipped off the side of that bed there. And so it can show you the difference here where on the left side, this was well covered all winter, and on the right side, it wasn't, because the mulch either blew away or just got pushed off, right? And you can really see the difference, and look at that's worm castings there, right? So that is soil that you just drop a seed in there, you couldn't really stop something from growing, right? And so that's what you're looking for by really protecting the soil in the winter, and really investing in the nutrients and the organic matter in the fall, and then giving it the water and the time it needs to work. The other interesting thing about this is, if you're coming into a garden situation where maybe you've relied heavily on rototilling in the past, tend to leave your soil a little more bare, maybe you tend to use more of some of the synthetic fertilizers, even organic fertilizers, but not high carbon, or maybe not mulch, you leave your soil bare, or use a plastic mulch, so your soil is relatively low in organic matter and lower in biological activity. It takes a little time for the population to catch up, and we see this a lot too on farms as they transition from a conventional tillage to a no-till. So it takes a little while for the biology to catch up, because you have to get the population big enough, right? And then once it does, you can really see a difference. The mulch starts breaking down much more quickly. The soil color starts to change much more quickly. It's like it reaches kind of a tipping point of biology, and that's a pretty cool thing to see. So we do have compost available this fall, some nice screened compost, and we have that available at $60 a yard, and we can provide delivery. So please reach out to us if that's helpful to you in any way. We don't have raised bed mix in the fall. We will have that in the spring. And I would love to answer any questions. Thank you for tuning in tonight. And Janet, I think, is going to share in the chat also some resources, a couple of articles I've written, and also a link to my YouTube channel where I've shared recordings like this from other classes I've taught over the years. So hopefully that's useful to you. And I'm actually really excited to hear from you all. Any questions or things you've tried? I recognize a few names in here, folks who have a lot of experience gardening in the Bighorn Basin, and so anything you've tried that worked or didn't work. And I'd love to open it up for questions here. Let's see. You're welcome to just share it in the chat. Janet will help me keep track of that, or you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like. Janet just shared. Oh, Micah says, Micah, nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. Had concerns with toxins leaching out of cardboard. I have never, I do know Linda, and she's very smart and knows a lot. I have never had a concern of that or heard that concern. One thing that I do know is that when we keep the soil really healthy and high biological activity, those microbes are breaking down most of those toxins, right? If we have a lot of biological activity in our soil. And I'm not familiar with what specifically those might be in cardboard. And I know that cardboard is also used a lot in worm farming and worm composting as well. So that is a good question. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer to that. Newspaper can also be used if you are concerned. So newspaper, but just really thick. So using not one sheet, but like the entire paper and layering that together. Yeah, so those are other things that can be used. Let's see, have you experienced growth of alfalfa or barley after using straw or hay for compost? Yes, barley or oats or wheat that come out in the straw, as mulch, or particularly if you're doing straw bale gardening, I have seen that grow. Fortunately, it doesn't seem too aggressive, and it's easy to pull it out around the edges of things and then just lay it right down again for mulch. I've never had that issue with alfalfa. Typically, alfalfa is harvested so well before it goes to seed. So perhaps if the field was harvested extremely late, but I've never had much with alfalfa taking off after using hay. The biggest issues I've had, now again, I hope someone will chime in if they have something else to share in their personal experience. The biggest issues I've had is with hay, grass hay, because those are perennial grasses, right? And they're often cut later in the season in some cases, or they're weedier, and then you're putting a lot of those in your garden, and we've had problems with that in the past. But the barley is an annual, and it doesn't particularly invasive, so you can kind of just pull it out and lay it down as mulch. But again, if anybody else has any experiences, you're welcome to chime in. Weight on my chicken manure in the fall. So that's one of the great things about applying animal manure in the fall, is that you don't have to worry about either disease that animals might carry, that be an animal manure, or that it being really too hot. And so that gives you the entire fall and winter for that to mellow in the soil, for the microbes and the worms to work on it, for it to become more incorporated into the soil. And so that's the advantage of applying your chicken manure in the fall. And then come spring, it should be ready to go. Now, of course, you can over apply. If you could certainly overdo it, and that no matter what you did, you could overdo it. But if you spread your chicken manure in the fall, it's not going to be too hot come spring. How do farmers handle no-till when they're talking about huge acreages? That's a really good question. They have really big equipment to do no-till. And they also rely heavily on herbicides to help with weed control, because often we use, in organic vegetable production, tillage is often used as one method for weed control. So when you don't have tillage, when you're committed to not using tillage, then herbicides can sometimes be used instead, or often used instead. And they just have very big no-till planters and drills. Is there any other questions, or anybody want to chime in who maybe has some experience or tried some things that worked or didn't work rather? I know Ernie knows a few things.
Hi, Caitlin. This is Ernie.
Hi, Ernie.
How are you?
Good. Nice to see you
Good.
here tonight. Do you have anything you've tried that worked or didn't work for you?
Well, I'm actually doing I'm in the middle of planting my garlic for the following year, for next year.
Oh, good.
And I I raise homing pigeons, so I'm using the pigeon manure in place of like chicken manure and sheep manure and stuff like that. What I do is I put the garlic in. I've actually broad forked the area after I put the pigeon manure down, watered it real good, then broad forked it, and then I'm going to put the garlic in and then mulch it with leaves and grass clippings until spring. And I usually leave the mulch on and let the garlic just poke up through it and leave it on.
Yeah, that's a good point. Most things will do pretty well growing up through some mulch. You know, some of your in the spring, some of your really tiny seeded things like your lettuce or carrots, they may really struggle to get up through that mulch, in which case you can just pull it back and give them a little space. But most things, especially garlic, any of the bigger, larger seeded vegetables, will do a surprisingly good job of pushing up through that mulch.
Yep, it works for me.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. Yeah. Well, thank you all for, oh, here we go. I had an increase in earwigs and slugs with my leaf mulch in the garden this year. This is a great point. So we have more biology and more life, and sometimes that biology and that life can also be inconvenient, right? And so I have had very good luck with diatomaceous earth for earwigs. Anything with an exoskeleton. It's very non-toxic, pretty affordable, and you can sprinkle it around different plants that are being chewed on. And that's done really well for me. I brought in a bunch of arborist mulch one time that had been sitting out, I think, for a year, and it was probably full of earwigs, and I didn't realize it. And I put it around my perennial landscaping, and had some flowers they liked, and they just clobbered it. But as soon as I figured out what was going on, I was able to treat the whole area pretty thoroughly with diatomaceous earth, and that took care of it right away. So that's something that's worked for me. Slugs I have not struggled with, although I have read and seen advertised that wool can be used as a slug deterrent. There's a company out of the UK actually that sells wool pellets that are labeled for that as a slug and snail repellent, and I suspect it's pretty scratchy to them, or it's a deterrent. So that would be something else you might consider trying. Can you use raccoon poop? Okay, this is a great question, and I'm sorry I didn't include a slide. I almost did about pet manure, and I didn't include it today. Yes, and there's a high risk involved with anything like that, dog, cat, raccoon, anything that might carry diseases or parasites. The soil doesn't care. The soil wants nutrients. The soil microbes and worms are going to break it down. It's going to get incorporated in some way, but if there's some way that it comes in contact with your food, there is some potential risk there, right? So if it's buried, or there are many ways that people do kind of in-ground digesters for pet waste. You could look that up, or you could bury a garbage can in the ground with holes in the sides, and then put your pet waste or your raccoon poop or whatever in there, and then some leaves or some carbon material, and then it will feed the roots, you know, it will feed the below ground and never come in contact with any food. The same with meat scraps or dairy or anything like that. You'll hear that a lot. Don't use that in your garden. It's mostly just high risk and attracts pests, but it does the soil microbes will break it down just the same. And then food grade diatomaceous earth. I have only used diatomaceous earth that was labeled, like that was purchased through a garden center. And so I don't know the difference between that and non-food grade, but I assume I want to be very thoughtful about what else might be in it. Certainly, Janet shared one in the description here. And it doesn't take very much. It's almost, to me, it's been hard to apply it lightly enough. Like you can just barely sprinkle it on because it's just enough for those, anything with an exoskeleton to crawl over. Great questions. Hopefully there's a little tidbits here that might be useful to you, and just remind you to keep that soil really well covered and protected. And to let things get a little wild and give plenty of room for the organisms there and the worms to work, and to keep that soil fed and protected all winter. Thank you, and I will send this recording out here shortly, and you're welcome to rewatch it or share with others as well. And I'll be doing a few more this spring. I would like to do one as it gets closer into the spring on seed selection for Wyoming and what seeds do well here, and a few other things as well. So stay tuned, and let me know if we can be of service in any way. I'm going to share the our website here in the chat. If you are in need of compost or raised bed mix or topsoil at some point, always happy to help. So thank you.